All right, so I've written on the board here the two forms that I've been talking about. The form that you have there in Genesis 18, verse 2, Vayish Tachu, and again, the root of this, the shin and the he, and then here with this is from the verb root, shacha. It would end normally with, of course, the he. And again, that, and then the second form is from the root kava, where you have this middle letter that is a consonant. So in this form, find this variety passage from Genesis to Jeremiah and beyond, this hishtafel. So you would parse this form as a hishtafel, imperfect, vav consecutive, or what we sometimes refer to as the vayiktal form, the imperfect. But here note that we have two vavs. One is a consonant vav, and the other is the shurik, or the plural ending. So again, this is a hishtafel form, the only verb, chava, that takes this particular form in the Hebrew Bible. So chava is the root, this form. So the only way you can tell the difference when you're reading through a text and you come upon this particular form, whether it's in the Vayiktal form or whether it's just a simple, there's perfect forms, there are imperfect forms of the hishtafel related to this verb kava. Now, one of the things that I like to talk about this because it is the word most often translated worship in the Old Testament. But the concept of worship in the ancient world comes from the context of honor before king, a dignitary, or before a god. And it involves, like shaka, a bowing down before an honorific individual or before deity. So the hishtafel is very much like the hithpael, but involves, again, the shin form, as I mentioned a moment ago, is like a causative form. So it's a little bit more intensive than a normal hithpael that you have in this vayishtachu form that you have there in Genesis 18, verse 2. So the idea of the hithpael in what we call the syntactical nature of the Hebrew verb denotes either repeated action or continuous action. So this is not, even though you use this vayiktal form, which is often an indicative of a past tense, that is a sequence of events in past time, it also carries forth what we call durative or continuous action that's denoted by the particular verb that we find in the hithpael. So that's one of the things to note with the uses of the hithpael, and likewise the hishtafel, which is again a little more intensive or deliberate action taken by an individual who is performing whatever action. But here again, only uniquely this verb, which is very often translated worship. Now again, worship and paying homage or paying honor comes from the original setting, like in the court of a king. So when you are, you're asked by, say, messengers to come before the king in the context of the king's bidding for you to carry out some task, you would come before the king. You would bow down before the king, literally to fall down on your face. Like you've seen the Muslim at prayer time when they get down on their knees and bow forward, their arms extended. That would be the honorific form in the ancient Near East of bowing before the king. So that's stage one of a process, but again, highlighting the durative action of the hithpael and that one does this voluntarily or deliberatively. You're requested by the king to bow down. When then you have paid homage to the king or to, as in worship settings we talk about, before God, bow down. And then in the court of the king, before the next stage, the king would ask you to stand. Another very important word to denote in various places throughout the Old Testament, standing before a king or standing in a place of service. This is what you do to prepare to then be given instructions to carry out the bidding of the king. And so there's, again, it's part of the sequence of honoring the king. He lifts you up to a place of honor because now you are going to act on behalf of the king in carrying out his planned duty, task, and so forth. The durative action then continues as you receive those instructions, and then in obedience to the king, you carry out whatever task he has assigned to you. So this is, again, a very, very appropriate word in all that I've described for worship. That we gathered together in our communities of faith with this attitude of humility. In some church contexts, they have bowing down for prayers or praying on kneeling benches, or people coming forward to an altar and bowing down to pray, or other settings that we have in responses to our appeals for people to come forward and to make their commitments to God. But then the task of the obedient servants in our congregations are in the worship service, as we sometimes call it. It's unfortunate that we have too often reduced in some of our nomenclature. The concept of worship is some part of a service, like the singing part or other prayer parts, or what is the worship? Well, it's all worship because worship is continuous. Worship is not supposed to stop. That's denoted by the nature of this particular Hebrew word in the hishtafel form, that as we come together to worship, we praise God, bow down before him, spiritually speaking or physically speaking. In the hearing of the word, message from God, we are given our task to carry out before God, and then we are to go forth as we exit our quote-unquote worship service, so that we carry out our worship service before our King Jesus. And so the concept of worship is embedded throughout the Old Testament, but also the New Testament carries forth, and that's why I think one of my favorite passages in the New Testament in the Pauline letters is Romans 12:1 and 2. What are we to do? We are to present our bodies as continual living sacrifices to carry out the work of God and to prove what the will of God is. In our worship, our service to God is essentially the explaining of the Hebrew concept of worship that's embedded in the use of the verb kabah in the hishtafel form. So very important concept is that our lives are to be continually lives of worship before God. And we meet to worship in community, and we go forth in families or in individuals as groups, but still as the community of faith, carrying forth the worship of God as we serve him and share his redemption in our community, sharing the love of Christ and the works of Christ out there in our communities as we share the gospel.